The breeze of early spring drifted over the rooftops of Porto Celeste, carrying with it the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint tang of the restless sea. The town, perched on a rugged crescent of the Italian coast, seemed to awaken in slow, gentle layers. Sunlight spilled over terracotta tiles, painting ripples of gold on the weathered stones of narrow streets. Laundry lines fluttered like colorful flags between pastel houses, and the calls of awakening vendors echoed softly from the piazza below, a melody as ancient as the town itself. In the heart of this tranquil tapestry, Livia stood at the open window of her small apartment, elbows propped on the sill, chin resting on her hands. The salty wind tugged at a loose strand of her dark hair, and she closed her eyes, breathing in the mingled scents of coffee from the cafe downstairs and wildflowers from some unseen garden. The sounds of her childhood, faint church bells, the creak of fishermen's carts, laughter too distant to touch, felt both familiar and painfully foreign. It had been 5 years since she'd last called Porto Celeste home. 5 years of chasing dreams in cities that sparkled with promise and left her heart bruised in quiet places. She'd returned only recently, her suitcase heavier with disappointment than belongings, seeking refuge in the rooms of her late grandmother's apartment. The walls, faded with time and lined with shelves of old books, seemed to hold fragments of warmth, a comfort she hadn't realized she'd missed until she was wrapped in it once more. Livia traced the outline of a chipped ceramic cup on the windowsill, her mind turning over memories and regrets. She had come back to heal, to find herself among the stones and stories that had shaped her. Yet every morning, as she watched the town come alive, a dull ache settled in her chest, a longing for something unnamed, for connection, for purpose. The world felt both too small and too vast, and she found herself caught in the quiet tension of belonging and not belonging. Across the narrow street in a villa shaded by ancient olive trees, Marco moved through his morning with the precision of habit. He pushed open the heavy wooden shutters, letting the light spill across a worn desk scattered with sketches and letters left unanswered. His movements were quiet, careful, as if not to disturb the ghosts that lingered in the corners of the house. Marco's presence filled the space, not loud but solid like the cliffs that held the town above the sea. He was a man shaped by silence. Years ago, tragedy had carved a hollow in his life, a loss that echoed in every footstep, in the solitary meals he took at the kitchen table, in the way he paused before speaking as if weighing each word against some invisible scale. People in town spoke of Marco with a blend of respect and distance, their voices lowering as they recalled the accident that had taken his father, the responsibilities that had fallen onto his shoulders too soon. He had become a fixture of the landscape, steady, reliable, and, to most, unknowable. Yet beneath the surface, Marco's heart beat with a quiet longing not unlike Livia's, a yearning for something to break the monotony, to fill the ache left by years of duty and unspoken grief. He spent his mornings tending to the garden his mother had loved, coaxing life from the soil with hands that remembered softer days. In the afternoons he wandered the cliffs, sketchbook in hand, capturing the way sunlight danced on the waves or the silhouette of a lone fishing boat against the horizon. The world, for Marco, was a series of small rituals, a way to hold chaos at bay. Despite living only steps apart, Livia and Marco moved through their days as distant satellites, their orbits never quite intersecting. If they crossed paths on the street, it was with averted eyes or a nod so brief it could be mistaken for a trick of the light. The space between them was charged with something that went beyond mere indifference, a silent, simmering resentment that neither cared to examine too closely. The roots of their discord ran deep, tangled in misunderstandings, and the kind of old wounds that towns like Porto Celeste never let heal. Years ago, a family dispute, over land, inheritance, or perhaps simply pride, had set their parents at odds. Words had been spoken, doors slammed, and the children had inherited the bitterness like a birthright. For Livia, Marco was the boy who had once refused to share his crayons in school, who had grown into the man who never greeted her at the market. For Marco, Livia was the girl who had laughed at his awkwardness, who had left the town as if it, and everyone in it, were not enough. Yet as the town basked in the gentle gold of morning, there lingered a subtle tension, an awareness of the other's presence that neither could quite ignore. In the quiet moments, When the world slowed and the distractions of daily life faded, both found themselves thinking of the other, wondering perhaps what had truly been lost in the years of silence. Olá, linda alma romântica. Antes de começarmos nossa história de hoje, convido você a se inscrever e curtir, para que possamos continuar compartilhando essas histórias emocionantes juntos. E me diga nos comentários, de que canto do mundo você está ouvindo esta noite? The market, as it did every Thursday, transformed the sleepy piazza into a riot of color and sound. Stalls overflowed with glossy tomatoes, bunches of basil, wheels of cheese and baskets of lemons so bright they seemed to capture the sun itself. The air was thick with the aroma of baking bread and the boisterous chatter of neighbors exchanging news and laughter. It was here, among the crush of bodies and the music of daily life, that Livia's and Marco's paths were destined to collide. Livia held her basket close to her side, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. She paused before a stall laden with violets and rosemary, her fingers skimming the petals, when she heard a familiar voice, low, measured, unmistakably Marco's, bartering with the fishmonger a few steps away. Her heart gave a small involuntary leap, a reaction she immediately chastised herself for. She turned her attention back to the flowers, willing herself to blend into the background. But fate, ever insistent, had other plans. A sharp word from a vendor, a sudden jostling in the crowd, and before she knew it, her basket slipped from her hand, its contents tumbling in a small chaotic cascade at Marco's feet. He looked down, expression unreadable, then slowly crouched to retrieve a bruised apple. Their eyes met, hers wide with embarrassment, his cool and steady. For a moment the noise of the market faded, replaced by the silent electricity crackling between them. "You dropped this," Marco said, holding out the apple. His voice was gentle, but there was a guardedness to it, as if each syllable were measured and weighed before being offered. Livia hesitated, pride warring with gratitude. "Thank you," she replied, her tone clipped but softening as she reached for the fruit. Their fingers brushed and the contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver up her spine. He stood, dusting off his hands. "You should be more careful. The market can be overwhelming." She bristled, hearing an old accusation in his words, though perhaps it was only her own defensiveness speaking. "I've managed markets in cities 10 times this size," she said, chin lifting in challenge. A corner of Marco's mouth twitched, too quickly to be called a smile, but enough to suggest amusement. "Then Porto Celeste should be easy for you." Their exchange might have ended there, two people clinging to the safety of old grievances, but the world conspired to keep them together a moment longer. The vendor, eager to settle a minor confusion over payment, thrust a handful of change at Livia, knocking her basket once more. Marco steadied it with one hand, his touch sure and unhurried. "Some things don't change," he murmured, almost to himself. Livia's cheeks flushed. "No, I suppose they don't." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to unpack. She gathered her things, her movements brisk, but as she turned away she caught the faintest glimmer of something in Marco's eyes, a sadness perhaps, or a longing she didn't dare name. As she walked home, the basket digging into her arm, Livia replayed the encounter in her mind. She told herself it meant nothing, a fleeting moment in a small town where people's lives inevitably brushed against each other. Yet she couldn't ignore the way her hands trembled, or the echo of Marco's voice lingering in her thoughts like a stubborn melody. Marco watched her go, his gaze lingering on the sway of her hair, the determined set of her shoulders. He felt a familiar ache, a mix of regret and resentment tangled in memories he had never fully understood. He turned back to his errands, but nothing he touched that morning seemed quite real. The apples felt too smooth, the coins too cold, the words of the vendors distant and muffled. The days that followed unfolded with a peculiar rhythm. Livia found herself noticing Marco's presence at odd intervals, the shape of his silhouette against the sky as he walked the cliffs at dusk, the sound of his laughter, rare but unguarded, echoing from the garden when he spoke with his aging mother. She caught herself glancing from her window at the glow of light from his study late at night, wondering what thoughts kept him company in those quiet hours. Marco in turn became attuned to Livia's comings and goings. He watched her linger at the cafe, her notebook open but her gaze far away, lost in a world he could only imagine. He noticed the way she paused to greet the stray cats that prowled the alleys, the gentle patience in her voice when she spoke with the children who played in the square. Each observation unsettled him, chipping away at the wall he had built so carefully between them. There were moments, small, almost imperceptible, when the past seemed to loosen its grip. One afternoon, as rain threatened on the horizon, Livia stood beneath the awning of the bakery, waiting for the storm to pass. Marco, emerging from the post office with letters tucked under his arm, paused beside her. For a heartbeat they shared the silence, listening to the patter of the first drops on cobblestone. "It's been a while since we had a real storm," Marco ventured, his voice low. Livia nodded, hugging her coat tighter. "I used to love watching them from the cliffs, the way the sea changes color." He glanced at her, surprised by the admission. "Me too. It makes everything feel different. Like the world is starting over." The words lingered between them, unexpectedly intimate, but just as quickly, the moment passed. Livia shifted, her eyes darting away. Marco cleared his throat, mumbling a polite farewell before stepping into the rain. Yet something had shifted, a thread pulled taut, straining against the weight of old hurts. They continued to circle each other, their lives entwined by proximity, and the unspoken knowledge that beneath resentment, something softer waited to be unearthed. Neither was ready to name it, but both felt its presence, as persistent and undeniable as the tide that shaped the shores of Porto Celeste. The rain came and went, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, as if the sky too wrestled with an unspoken longing. The days in Porto Celeste seemed to stretch and curl around the moods of the weather, and Livia found herself navigating the hours with a restless energy she could not name. In the mornings, she would press her forehead to the cool window pane, watching the market square below come alive, voices rising like birdsong, the air bright with the scent of citrus and promise. Her homecoming, once meant to be a quiet retreat, now felt charged with anticipation, each day marked by the possibility of crossing paths with Marco. She busied herself with small rituals, brewing coffee in the chipped porcelain pot that had belonged to her grandmother, arranging wildflowers in a glass jar, letting the music of old records fill the rooms. Yet no matter how she tried to anchor herself in the comfort of routine, her thoughts wandered, circling inevitably back to Marco. She remembered their conversation on the cliffs, the way his words had lingered, unexpectedly gentle. It unsettled her, this tenderness. She was more accustomed to their silent battles, the sharpness of exchanged glances, the way old hurts could flare up with nothing more than a passing word. The town, for its part, seemed determined to place them in each other's way. One afternoon, while the sun pressed through grey clouds, Livia found herself in the corner cafe, the place where she'd always come to read and think. The room was warm, humming with quiet conversations, the aroma of coffee and almond pastries wrapping around her like an embrace. She settled by the window, tracing the rim of her cup, letting her gaze drift over the street outside. It was then that Marco entered, his presence as solid and disruptive as a sudden gust of wind. He paused, scanning the room, his eyes meeting hers for a moment too long. There was a beat, a hesitation, before he took the table opposite hers, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. For a while, they sat in silence, each pretending to be absorbed in their own world. But the cafe was small, and the air between their tables pulsed with a kind of electricity. Eventually, Livia spoke, unable to bear the weight of unspoken things. "You always order the same," she said, nodding toward the black coffee in his hands. "You never try the pastries." Marco looked up, surprised by the casualness of her tone. "Old habits," he replied, his voice low. "Some things are easier left unchanged." She smiled, soft but edged. "But sometimes change is good. You might discover you like something new." There was a challenge in her words, a flicker of something playful. He considered her, his gaze steady. And sometimes, trying something new means risking disappointment. The words hung between them, freighted with more meaning than the conversation allowed. They stayed like that, exchanging small remarks, letting the rhythm of the cafe fill the silences. At times their laughter would slip out, quiet and unguarded, surprising them both. But just as easily, the old friction could return. A careless comment, a misunderstood glance, and the wall would slide back into place. Still, neither could deny the subtle shift, the way their interactions had begun to change, hesitant but hopeful. Outside, the rain started again, drumming softly on the glass. As she watched the drops racing down the window, Livia wondered if the world was trying to tell her something. She felt a pull toward Marco that was equal parts fear and curiosity, a desire to understand the man beneath the armor. But every step closer brought the risk of reopening old wounds, memories of harsh words spoken in anger, misunderstandings that had grown roots and flourished in absence. That evening, as dusk settled over Porto Celeste, Livia wandered the narrow lanes, letting the cool air clear her mind. The town was quieter now, the shops shuttered, the only sounds the distant crash of waves and the hush of her own footsteps. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with Marco, who looked as surprised as she felt. He stepped back, an apology on his lips, but she only shrugged, offering a wry smile. For a moment they stood in the golden spill of lamplight, the world around them holding its breath. "Do you ever regret coming back?" Marco asked, his voice so soft she almost missed it. It was an honest question, and it caught her off guard. Livia hesitated, searching his face for mockery but finding only a quiet vulnerability. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not tonight." He nodded, the barest hint of a smile touching his mouth. The silence between them was different now, less heavy, more like a question waiting to be answered. She wanted to ask him what he regretted, what weighed on his heart, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said, "It's easier to remember the bad things, isn't it? Harder to let the good ones in." Marco looked away, his jaw tightening. "The bad things are louder, they echo." They parted soon after, but the encounter left Livia restless, the echo of his words following her home. She lay awake long after midnight, listening to the wind rattling the shutters, wondering how much of her resentment was truly hers and how much had been inherited from stories told by others. She had always believed she understood why they had kept their distance, why every interaction was colored by suspicion and pride, but now she was not so sure. Days passed, each one marked by small, accidental meetings. At the bakery, their hands brushed as they reached for the same loaf of bread. On the stone steps leading down to the harbor, they found themselves pausing to watch the fishermen haul in their nets, standing side by side in companionable silence. With each encounter, the shape of their animosity seemed to soften, revealing something more fragile beneath. One afternoon, Livia found herself helping at the old church on the square, assisting Signora Bartoli with preparations for the upcoming festival. The air buzzed with anticipation, colored streamers fluttering from every balcony, the smell of sweet dough and lemons drifting through the streets. Livia moved through the tasks with practiced grace, but her mind wandered, replaying snippets of conversation, the warmth in Marco's eyes when he smiled. She was arranging flowers at the altar when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Marco standing in the doorway, hat in hand, uncertainty written across his features. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice light but cautious. He shrugged, glancing at the floor. "Signora Bartoli asked me to fix the bell tower. It's creaking again." She nodded, hiding a smile. "That old bell has more lives than a cat." He grinned, the tension easing. "It always finds a way to be heard, even when no one wants to listen." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding of stubborn things, of hearts that refused to be silenced. Later, as they worked side by side, their conversation meandered from trivialities to memories, from the weather to stories of childhood summers spent on the cliffs. Livia found herself laughing more than she had in years, the sound unfamiliar and freeing. For a moment, the walls between them seemed almost transparent, and she wondered what it would be like to let them fall completely. But with closeness came vulnerability. That evening, as the festival lights flickered to life and music spilled into the streets, Livia saw Marco speaking with her uncle, his expression guarded. She caught only fragments of their conversation, but it was enough to ignite old anxieties. Her family's warnings, whispered suspicions about the past, the reminders that some wounds ran too deep to heal. The next day, she avoided Marco, retreating into the safety of routine. Yet everywhere she turned, reminders of him lingered. A half-finished cup of coffee at the cafe, the sound of his voice echoing through the market, the sight of his jacket forgotten on the church pew. She tried to convince herself that distance was for the best, that their growing closeness was a mistake. But the ache in her chest told another story. Marco, too, felt the shift. He noticed Livia's absence like a missing note in a familiar song. The days felt emptier, the town quieter. He threw himself into work, repairing boats and tending to the olive grove behind his villa, but nothing could silence the questions that circled in his mind. Had he said something wrong? Had the past finally caught up with them? One evening, unable to bear the uncertainty, he found himself standing outside Livia's apartment, the soft glow of her lamp spilling onto the cobblestones. He hesitated, torn between the urge to knock and the fear of rejection. In the end, he left a note tucked beneath her door, a simple message, more a plea than a declaration. "I miss our conversations. If you ever want to talk, I'll be on the cliffs at sunset." Livia found the note the next morning, her heart thudding in her chest as she read the words. She pressed the paper to her lips, torn between hope and fear. The day stretched endlessly, every task tinged with anticipation, the hours crawling toward evening. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Livia made her way to the cliffs. The wind whipped her hair around her face, carrying the scent of salt and wild herbs. Marco stood at the edge, his silhouette outlined against the vastness of the sea, shoulders tense with expectation. She approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by the grass. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the distant cry of gulls and the hush of the waves below. "Thank you for coming," Marco said at last, his voice rough with emotion. Livia nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I almost didn't. I was afraid." He turned, searching her face. "Afraid of what?" She hesitated, the words trembling on her tongue. "Of what it means to let go of the past, to forgive, to start again." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, hesitant but sure. "I'm afraid too, but I don't want to keep running from what's here. From you." The confession hung in the air, fragile and luminous. Livia squeezed his hand, the warmth of his touch grounding her. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that healing was possible, that the pain of the past did not have to define the future. Together they stood at the edge of the world, two souls battered by storms but still reaching for the light. The wind wrapped around them, and for a moment, the burdens they carried felt lighter, the path ahead illuminated by the promise of something new. The days that followed moved with a quiet, tentative hope, as if the entire town itself was holding its breath, watching the fragile threads of possibility weaving between Livia and Marco. The spring rain had washed the air clean, leaving behind a world shimmering with promise. Yet for all that was unspoken and unresolved, there was a gentleness now in the way their lives brushed against each other, a softening of the edges that had once kept them apart. Mornings began with the distant sound of church bells, their chimes mingling with the cries of gulls that circled above the restless tide. Livia found herself rising early, drawn to the hush of the dawn before the town truly woke. She would stand by her small kitchen window, a cup of coffee warming her palms, and watch as the first rays of light painted the sea in shades of gold and rose. Sometimes, if she looked closely, she could spot Marco in the garden across the street, his silhouette outlined against the silvery dew, tending to the olive trees with slow, deliberate care. There was something in his movements, an unspoken poetry, that made her chest ache with an emotion she could not name. Marco, too, was changed. The solitude he had once worn like armor now felt heavy, constricting, as if the silence of his villa pressed too tightly against his skin. He found himself listening for the sound of Livia's laughter, the light cadence of her footsteps in the stairwell, the way her voice rose and fell like a melody half remembered. He noticed things he had never allowed himself to see before, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the determined set of her jaw, the tenderness she showed to stray cats in the alleyway. One afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of rain-soaked earth, their paths crossed again in the heart of the town. The piazza was alive with color and noise, vendors calling out their wares, children darting between stalls, the air thick with the promise of summer. Livia was haggling with an elderly woman over a basket of figs, her laughter bright and free. When Marco appeared at her side, a loaf of bread cradled in his arms. Their eyes met, his calm and steady, hers luminous with surprise, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. The silence between them was fraught, yet not uncomfortable, as if a new language was being written in the space where words had once failed. "Figs?" Marco asked, offering a hesitant smile. Livia nodded, her cheeks warming. "They remind me of childhood. My grandmother used to make jam from the fruit in her garden." He glanced at the figs, then at her, a gentle teasing in his voice. "Did she teach you her secrets, or will your jam end up as tragic as your last attempt at bread?" She laughed, the sound tumbling out before she could stop it. "Perhaps you should be the judge of that, if you're brave enough." They walked together through the market, their conversation easy, flowing like the lazy current of the river that wound through the town's edge. With each shared memory and playful barb, the distance between them shrank, replaced by something warmer, more intimate. They spoke of small things, recipes, the stubbornness of tomato plants, the old legend of the bells that rang only for those who dared to hope. Yet beneath the surface, deeper currents ran, the ache of absence, the longing for belonging, the fear of reaching out, only to be left empty-handed. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, Livia and Marco found themselves standing before the old church at the heart of the town. The doors were open, the scent of incense drifting out into the twilight. Without speaking, they slipped inside, letting the hush of the sacred space settle around them. Candles flickered, their flames trembling in the still air, casting halos of light against the worn stone walls. Livia sat in a pew near the back, her hands folded in her lap. Marco hesitated, then joined her, the space between them charged with things unsaid. For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound was the distant murmur of prayers and the soft creak of wood beneath their weight. Finally Livia broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant to stay haunted by the things we've lost?" Marco considered this, his gaze fixed on the altar, where shafts of colored light fell from stained glass windows. "I think sometimes we choose to haunt ourselves. We hold on because letting go means admitting we can't change what's already happened." She nodded, the truth of his words settling into her bones. "I spent years running from this place, from memories. I thought if I kept moving, I could outrun the grief. But it followed me, Marco, it always does." He turned to her then, vulnerability etched in the lines of his face. "We all have ghosts, Livia. Mine kept me silent for too long. I lost people, my father, my brother, and I blame myself for not doing more, for not saying what needed to be said while there was still time." Livia's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm sorry. I never knew how much you carried." He reached out, his hand hovering above hers, uncertain. "I never let anyone see it. Not until now." Their fingers brushed, tentative, searching. In that quiet church, surrounded by the weight of old sorrows and new beginnings, something shifted. Livia turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his, and a fragile hope sparked between them, a promise that healing was possible, even for those who had believed themselves beyond repair. When they emerged into the evening, the town was bathed in the gentle glow of lanterns strung between buildings. The air was cool, carrying the faint melody of a violinist playing in a distant courtyard. Marco walked Livia home, their steps slow, unhurried. As they reached her door, a hush fell between them, heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. "Would you," Marco began, his voice rough with emotion, "join me for dinner tomorrow? I thought maybe we could cook together, like before." Livia smiled, her heart fluttering in her chest. "I'd like that." The next day dawned bright and clear, sunlight pouring through the windows and filling every corner with warmth. Livia spent the morning in a quiet excitement, gathering ingredients and humming to herself as she moved about her kitchen. When Marco arrived, carrying a basket of fresh herbs and a bottle of wine, there was a comfortable ease between them, as if the ghosts that had haunted their past had retreated, at least for now. They cooked side by side in Marco's kitchen, laughter mingling with the sizzle of olive oil and the tang of tomatoes in the air. There were moments of clumsy grace, Livia nearly dropping a handful of basil, Marco burning his fingers on a hot pan, but each mishap only drew them closer, dissolving old tensions in the warmth of shared creation. They told stories, some light and silly, others tinged with melancholy. Marco spoke of his brother's mischievous pranks, the way his father used to whistle while pruning the vines. Livia recounted childhood summers spent by the sea, the taste of salt on her lips, the freedom of being young and unafraid. As the meal finished and the sky outside darkened to a deep indigo, they sat at the small table by the window, plates empty, glasses half full. The hush that descended was not uncomfortable. Rather, it was the hush of contentment, the peace that comes from being truly seen. Marco reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted, "but I do know I don't want to go back to the way things were. Not with you." Livia squeezed his fingers, her smile gentle. "We can start small, a day at a time." They lingered in that quiet, the world outside fading into darkness. The only sounds were the distant crash of waves and the rhythmic thrum of their own hearts, beating in tentative harmony. But life, as always, is not without its shadows. A few days later, news spread through the town of a dispute between their families, an old land disagreement reignited by a careless remark from an uncle at the cafe. Whispers grew, old wounds reopened, and soon neighbors took sides, the air thickening with tension. Livia found herself caught between loyalty and longing, torn by the fear that the fragile peace she'd found with Marco would crumble beneath the weight of history. She tried to speak with Marco, but he had grown distant, withdrawn into himself, haunted by the same pride and pain that had once kept them apart. When she finally found him at the edge of the cliffs, staring out at the churning sea, his expression was unreadable. "I thought we were past this," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought we were building something new." He didn't turn to her, his shoulders rigid. "Maybe we were foolish to think we could escape the past. Some things are too deeply rooted." Livia felt a coldness settle in her chest. "Do you really believe that?" He hesitated, the struggle playing out across his face. "I don't know, I don't want to be the reason you have to choose between your family and—" His words faltered, the unspoken "me" hanging in the air. She stepped closer, reaching for him, but he pulled away, the distance between them suddenly vast. The wind howled, carrying the scent of salt and storm, and Livia wrapped her arms around herself, fighting back tears. "I can't lose you," she whispered, but her words were swallowed by the sea. Marco left without another word, and Livia returned to her apartment, the weight of heartbreak pressing down on her. The days that followed were grey and silent, the town's vibrant colours muted by sorrow. She moved through her routines like a ghost, haunted by memories of laughter and light, of hope that now seemed impossibly distant. Yet even as the world closed in around her, a stubborn ember of hope refused to die. One evening, as she sat by her window, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass, she found a letter slipped beneath her door. The handwriting was unmistakable, Marco's, bold and uneven. She unfolded the page with trembling hands, her heart pounding. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had been unable to say. "I am afraid, Livia, afraid of repeating old mistakes, of hurting you, of not being enough. But I am more afraid of losing the chance to try. If you still believe in us, even a little, meet me at the old stone bench by the sea at sunset." Tears spilled down her cheeks, not of pain but of relief. A release of all the fear and longing she had carried for so long. As the sun dipped low, painting the world in hues of gold and fire, Livia wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped out into the gathering dusk, her heart battered but hopeful, ready to face whatever waited on the edge of the world. The streets of the town were hushed beneath the gentle hush of twilight, the last rays of sunlight catching on damp stones and painting the air with a soft golden haze. Livia's steps were slow as she crossed the piazza, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, the salt of dried tears still on her cheeks. Each stride toward the old stone bench seemed to echo with the rhythm of her memories. Moments of laughter now distant, words spoken in anger, the stubborn ache of longing that had never truly faded. The world felt suspended, held in that breathless space between day and night, where everything might change if only for a moment. The sea was restless below, its surface burnished by the fading light, waves whispering secrets to the rocks as they tumbled endlessly to shore. The scent of rain lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy perfume of jasmine that climbed the walls nearby. Livia drew in the fragrance, letting it settle in her chest, calming the storm that still churned inside her. She could see the silhouette of the bench ahead, carved from ancient stone and worn smooth by years of sun and salt wind, a silent witness to so many stories, hers and Marco's among them. He was already there, standing with his back to her, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. For a moment she simply watched him, tracing the familiar curve of his shoulders, the way his hair caught the dying light. There was a vulnerability to him now, a quiet tension in the way he stood, as if he too was bracing against the tide of hope and fear. Livia hesitated, her breath caught between caution and longing, but then she stepped forward, gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. At the sound, Marco turned. His eyes found hers, uncertain at first, searching, then softening with something like relief. She saw the exhaustion written in the lines of his face, the hesitation in the way his lips parted and closed, words faltering on the edge. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It pulsed with all the things left unsaid, all the apologies and confessions that hung between them like mist. "I wasn't sure you would come," Marco said at last, his voice low and roughened by emotion. Livia's hands tightened around her shawl. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her tone quiet, vulnerable. "But I read your letter. I needed to know if it was true. If you meant it." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the worn stones at their feet. Every word. He hesitated, then looked up, the flicker of old fear in his eyes. "I have been foolish, Livia. I let the past shape too much of who I am now. I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was shut you out." A shiver ran through her, not from the chill, but from the weight of his honesty. She crossed the small distance between them, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. "I shut you out too," she whispered. "I was so afraid of being hurt again, of being disappointed. I kept telling myself I didn't care, but it was a lie. I cared every day." He smiled, a fragile thing, as if he was not sure he deserved it. "I missed you, Livia, even when I was angry, even when I tried to convince myself that I didn't." A soft, startled laugh escaped her, half relief, half disbelief. "I missed you too, even when I hated you." They stood there, words settling around them like leaves, and the moment stretched, delicate and new. The breeze caught at Livia's hair, tugging it free from its knot, and she lifted a hand to tuck it behind her ear, her fingers trembling. The old stone bench waited beside them, and Marco gestured to it, the invitation silent but clear. Livia nodded, and they sat side by side, close enough that their shoulders brushed, neither daring to move away. For a while they simply watched the sea, letting the hush of the evening fill the space between them. The rhythm of the waves seemed to slow the beat of Livia's heart, soothing the raw places inside her. She glanced sideways, studying Marco's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the shadows beneath his eyes. There was still so much she did not know about him, so many secrets tucked behind his silences, but she felt for the first time that he might let her in. "Why did you write the letter?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a breath. Marco was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky melted into the sea. "Because I was tired of hiding," he said finally. "Tired of pretending that I could forget you. I kept telling myself that I had to be strong, that I couldn't risk being hurt again, but I realized that the real risk was losing you forever, and I couldn't live with that." Livia blinked back tears, her throat tight. "I wish I had been braver," she said. "There were so many times I wanted to reach out, to say something, but I let my pride get in the way. I let old wounds speak louder than my heart." He turned to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We've both made mistakes, but we're here now." He hesitated, then reached for her hand, his touch gentle, uncertain. "Do you think we could try again? Not as who we were, but as who we are now." Her fingers curled into his, and she felt the warmth of his skin, the tremor in his grip. 100 doubts crowded her mind. questions about the future, about whether old pain could truly be healed. But beneath it all was a quiet certainty, a sense that, for once, she was exactly where she needed to be. "I want to try," she whispered, her voice shaking with hope. "I want to try with you." The relief that washed over Marco was palpable. He squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing small soothing circles against her skin. "We'll take it slowly," he promised. "No more running, no more silence." They sat in gentle quiet, the world shrinking to the space they shared on the weathered bench. The first stars pricked the sky, their light reflected in the restless sea, and the town behind them began to settle into sleep. Somewhere a bell chimed the hour, its sound distant and comforting. Livia leaned her head against Marco's shoulder, closing her eyes. She felt the tension leave her body, replaced by a sense of peace she had not known in years. The pain was not gone. It might never be. But it no longer defined her. She was more than her wounds, more than her fears. Marco rested his cheek atop her head, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gentle embrace. They did not speak, but words were unnecessary. In the hush of the evening, in the salt-laden air, everything they needed to say was carried in the way their bodies leaned toward each other, in the warmth of their clasped hands. Eventually, Livia drew back, lifting her gaze to meet Marco's. "There's so much we need to talk about," she said, a rueful smile curving her lips. "So much we need to forgive." He nodded, his expression solemn but hopeful. "We have time. I'm not going anywhere." A breeze stirred, sending the scent of jasmine drifting over them, and Livia laughed softly, the sound bright with possibility. "Promise," she teased, her eyes shining. "Promise," Marco replied, his voice steady. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, letting the weight of the promise settle. Then, slowly, Marco leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss as gentle as the night air, an apology, a question, and an answer all at once. Livia's eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope, to believe in new beginnings. When they parted, the world felt different, softer, kinder, as if the town itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Livia smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Let's walk," she suggested, rising and offering Marco her hand. He took it without hesitation, and together they strolled along the edge of the sea, their steps matching, the future uncertain but shared. The night was alive with the quiet music of waves and distant laughter, the moon casting a silvery path over the water. As they walked, they spoke in low voices, sharing stories and dreams, confessions and hopes. Marco told her of his fears, of failure, of not knowing how to love without losing himself, of the emptiness that had haunted him since his father's passing. Livia listened, her heart aching with understanding, and in turn she spoke of her own burdens, the weight of expectation, the loneliness of years spent away, the yearning for a place to belong. With every step, the old resentments fell away, replaced by a fragile trust. They did not pretend to have all the answers, they did not promise that it would be easy, but they promised, quietly, fiercely, to try. Eventually they returned to the little street where their home stood in silent vigil. The lamps glowed softly, casting elongated shadows on the cobblestones. Livia paused before her door, turning to Marco, her smile tinged with uncertainty. "Will you stay?" she asked, not ready to let the night end. Marco hesitated, then shook his head, though there was no rejection in his gaze. "Not tonight," he said gently, "but tomorrow, and the day after, as long as you want me." She nodded, understanding. They needed time, time to heal, to grow into this new version of themselves. She pressed her palm to his cheek, savoring the warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his gaze. "Good night, Marco," she whispered. "Good night, Livia." He watched as she slipped inside, the door closing softly behind her. For a moment, he stood in the quiet, the night pressing close, and felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he had not known in so long. Inside her apartment, Livia leaned against the door, her heart full. She moved to the window, gazing out at the restless sea, the distant outline of Marco's figure framed in silver moonlight. She smiled, a gentle, hopeful smile, and let herself believe that perhaps fate had not been so cruel after all. Outside, Marco lingered for a moment longer before turning toward his own home. The olive trees rustled in the night breeze, and the air was thick with the promise of spring. He knew there would be challenges ahead, days when old fears returned, when words failed. But he also knew deep in his bones that they would face them together. And so, as the town settled into sleep, as the stars wheeled overhead and the sea whispered its eternal lullaby, Livia and Marco began again, not erasing the past, but building something gentle and real amidst its ruins. Their hearts, once battered and weary, now beat with cautious hope, ready to welcome whatever tomorrow might bring. In the quiet, in the darkness, love bloomed, slow and steady, as inevitable as the dawn.